Welcome to episode 1 of The Evidence Room. Inside every investigation, the truth is hidden in the evidence.
And, sometimes that evidence points to things that just seem, well, completely impossible at first glance.
Right, exactly. I mean, imagine finding a body out in the woods. The victim has been shot in the back with a high-powered hunting rifle.
Which is a horrific scene all on its own.
Yeah, but then investigators examine the scene and they find something that just defies physical reality. There are absolutely no bullet holes in her clothing.
It's just chilling.
It really is. And today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that. We're unpacking this massive stack of 1980s police reports, FBI behavioral science memos, and decades-old psychiatric evaluations.
Right, to figure out how a predator weaponized both the harsh Alaskan wilderness and, surprisingly, a booming economy.
Exactly. We are looking at the case files of Robert Hansen, the man known as the Butcher Baker of Alaska.
And the real mission of this deep dive isn't just about what he did. It's about understanding the specific societal blind spots that allowed him to get away with it for so long.
So, to understand those blind spots, you really have to look at the economic ecosystem of Anchorage, Alaska in the 1970s.
Yeah, absolutely. When we read through these historical records, Anchorage isn't just this quiet, snowy outpost.
Right. I think people picture it as this sleepy little town.
Exactly, but it wasn't. The construction of the Trans-Alaska oil pipeline had triggered this massive, chaotic economic boom.
Just a total gold rush environment.
Exactly like a gold rush. You had an enormous influx of transient workers, roughnecks, engineers, laborers, and with them came, massive amounts of cash.
And whenever you have that sudden influx of wealth and transient men, a secondary economy almost immediately springs up to service them.
Right. And in Anchorage, that secondary economy materialized along 4th Avenue. It basically became this booming red light district.
Yeah, reading through these police files, you see a massive influx of sex workers, topless dancers, teenage runaways.
Women who travel to Alaska looking for a fresh start or, just trying to grab a piece of that pipeline money.
But they were entering a highly volatile environment.
Very volatile. But more importantly, it was highly anonymizing. The transient nature of the population meant that people were just constantly coming and going.
Which makes tracking anyone nearly impossible.
Right. If we look at the sociology of boomtowns, law enforcement often develops this fatalistic view of the population.
Like they just expect people to vanish.
Kind of, yeah. If a sex worker or a dancer disappeared from 4th Avenue, the default assumption by local authorities wasn't foul play.
Wow.
The assumption was simply that she had made enough money and moved on to the next town. Or, went back to the lower 48.
Which created the ultimate smokescreen for a predator.
Exactly.
But between 1980 and 1983, that assumption of just moving on, it started to physically unravel.
Because the Alaska State Troopers started finding the bodies.
Right, these horrifying discoveries. First, they found the remains of an unidentified woman they dubbed Aklutna Annie.
And she had been stabbed in the back and left near a power line.
Yeah. Then, they found Joanna Messina in a gravel pit. And later, in 1982, hunters stumbled across the remains of 23-year-old Sherry Morrow in a shallow grave near the Nick River.
And the forensic report on Sherry Morrow, that is the turning point in these files.
This is where we find that impossible detail we talked about at the start, right?
Exactly. She had been killed by a .223 caliber weapon, but her clothing, the clothes she was found buried in, were completely intact.
Okay, let's unpack this. If a person is shot, but their clothes aren't.
Right, the physical reality dictates that the killer forced her to strip naked.
Right, he executed her and then meticulously redressed her corpse before burying her.
Which is just, it's horrifying.
It is, and that isn't a robbery gone wrong. That is a deeply methodical, ritualistic process.
Yeah, it's the absolute hallmark of what the FBI classifies as an organized offender. This isn't someone acting in a frenzy.
They're treating it like a procedure.
Exactly. Redressing the body might have been a forensic countermeasure to hide the specific cause of death from just a casual discovery.
Or it was part of a psychological ritual of control.
Right. Either way, it indicated a killer who was incredibly patient, highly organized, and actively utilizing that boomtown chaos as a safety net.
And the man hiding in the center of that safety net was Bob Hansen.
Baker.
Right. If you had walked into his Anchorage bakery in the mid-1970s, you would have seen this mild-mannered local business owner.
Just a regular guy.
Yeah, he was married to a deeply religious woman named Darla, had 2 kids, and had been a staple in Anchorage since 1967.
He was well-liked, respected in the community.
And he was even a record-holding bow hunter. On paper, he was a totally normal, slightly nerdy guy.
But the historical documents reveal just how carefully constructed that facade really was.
Because if you pull the psychiatric evaluations from his early life, the picture changes
Oh,
dramatically.
completely. Hansen was born in Esterville, Iowa in 1939. His father was this strict Danish baker who subjected him to grueling labor.
But the critical psychological stressor was his social environment, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Hansen had a severe stutter and cystic acne that left his face uh, permanently scarred.
And because of this, he was relentlessly bullied by his peers.
Went relentlessly. And heavily rejected by women.
I was actually reading through the 1960 psychiatric evaluation from his time at the Anamosa State Penitentiary in Iowa.
Right, because he had a record before Alaska.
Yeah, he was sent there after burning down a school bus garage purely out of revenge.
Wow.
The prison psychiatrist actually diagnosed him with manic depression, which we'd call bipolar disorder today, along with schizophrenic episodes.
But the detail that really stands out in that evaluation is that the doctor specifically diagnosed him with an infantile personality.
Right. He noted that Hansen had an absolute obsession with revenge.
He couldn't process rejection at all. He just internalized it into this massive reservoir of rage.
And that reservoir of rage is the engine for everything that followed.
Because he felt fundamentally powerless in his daily social interactions. you
Yeah.
know. So he sought to violently extract that power from others.
And the tragic part is that his criminality was clearly documented long before the murders even began.
Yeah, that's the part of the police files that is just so frustrating to read.
Even after he moved to Alaska to start over, the crimes continued. In December 1971, he was arrested twice.
Not just for minor things either.
No. First, for kidnapping a housewife at gunpoint and attempting to rape her. And then, shortly after, for raping a sex worker.
Yet for these incredibly violent felonies, he ended up serving a mere 6 months in a halfway house out of a 5-year sentence.
6 months. And his wife Darla apparently just assumed his only dark secret was occasionally picking up prostitutes.
Well, the leniency of the justice system in 1971 wasn't an accident. It was actually a systemic feature at the time.
So?
When we look at how crimes against sex workers were prosecuted in the early 70s, they were frequently downgraded or dismissed.
Because prosecutors viewed it as a lack of victim credibility.
Exactly.
But I have to push back on how he maintained his standing in the community.
Okay, what do you mean?
You have a guy with a documented history of arson, a kidnapping conviction, and a rape conviction. How does a person with that specific rap sheet maintain a reputation as a harmless, nerdy baker in the eyes of his neighbors and local law enforcement?
It's wild, I know. The psychological mechanism at play there is known as the halo effect.
The halo effect.
Yeah, though in this case, it's operating as this extreme cognitive blind spot. The human brain naturally seeks harmony in its assessments of people.
So people see what they want to see.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
When a community sees a man who bakes their morning bread, goes to church, supports a family, their brains struggle to reconcile those mundane, pro-social traits with the extreme violence of kidnapping and rape.
So they just ignore the bad stuff.
Subconsciously, yes. The community and even law enforcement looked at this small, stuttering baker and concluded that his past crimes must have been aberrations.
Or just misunderstandings.
Exactly. And Hansen understood this. He weaponized his mild-mannered appearance to completely deflect suspicion.
And what he was doing behind that deflection is terrifying.
Truly the stuff of nightmares.
He would abduct these vulnerable women, often right off the streets of Anchorage, and hold them captive in his basement.
But he didn't usually kill them there.
No, he transported them to Merrill Field Airport, which brings us to the most cinematic and horrifying aspect of these files.
Yeah, the logistics of the murders demonstrate how Hansen used the Alaskan environment as an active tool of terror.
He owned a Piper PA-18 Super Cub bush plane, right?
He did. He would load these handcuffed women into the aircraft and fly them out to his remote cabin in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley.
And for anyone listening who is unfamiliar with that terrain, it is aggressively rugged.
Oh, it's brutal. It is accessible only by air or boat. It is total, absolute isolation.
He would fly them out there, strip them completely naked, set them free into the freezing Alaskan wilderness, and basically tell them to run.
And then he would hunt them.
He used a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle and sometimes just a hunting knife to track them down through the snow and the brush.
By stripping them naked, he wasn't just committing an assault. He was stripping away their humanity and making them entirely vulnerable to the harsh elements.
Which dramatically increased his own tactical advantage.
Exactly. He was engineering an environment where he couldn't possibly lose.
Here's where it gets really interesting from a psychological perspective.
Yeah.
If you look at the fact that he was already a record-holding game hunter, you realize the actual murder wasn't the main objective.
Right, it was the process.
The objective was the sadistic thrill of the chase itself. He was reducing human beings to big game to compensate for those lifelong feelings of inadequacy we talked about.
The stutter, the bullying, the rejections.
Exactly.
That compensatory mechanism is incredibly common in organized serial offenders. When you hunt an animal, you have the ultimate, unquestionable control over life and death.
And Hansen felt deeply inadequate in normal social dynamics with women.
Right. So he built a synthetic reality in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, where he was the apex predator, and women were reduced to prey.
And he needed physical reminders of that synthetic reality. After he buried them in shallow graves, he kept trophies.
The map and the jewelry.
Yeah, the police files detail how he hid a secret aviation map right behind the headboard of his bed. Every time he killed a woman, he marked the exact location of her grave with a tiny X.
He also stole their jewelry and hid it in his attic.
Those trophies, they serve as organizational anchors, don't they?
They do. The map allowed him to visually process his dominance. By looking at those marks, he could psychologically re-enter the hunt from the safety of his bedroom.
And the jewelry served a similar function?
Exactly. It was a tangible piece of the power he had stolen from them.
But that absolute power finally fractured on June 13th, 1983.
This is an incredible part of the story.
This is where the police files read like an actual thriller, centering on the unbelievable survival of 17-year-old Cindy Paulson.
Right.
Hansen approached her on the street, initially offering her $200, but instead of paying her, he pulled a .357 Magnum, forced her into his car, and took her back to his house.
He chained her by the neck to a post in his basement and tortured her.
And then he did something deeply unsettling. He just walked over to a nearby couch and took a nap.
Just went to sleep.
It's crazy.
The nap is one of the most revealing details in the entire case file, though. It demonstrates the profound normalization of extreme violence in Hansen's mind.
Because for the average person, having someone chained in their basement would induce massive adrenaline and panic.
But for Hansen, it was so routine, so utterly mundane, that his heart rate was low enough to fall asleep.
But he really underestimated Cindy Paulson. When he woke up, he handcuffed her, put her in his car, and drove her to Merrill Field to load her into his bush plane for the final hunt.
But as he turned his back for just a moment to prepare the cockpit,
Cindy saw her window. Still in handcuffs, she crawled out the driver's side door of the car and sprinted towards 6th Avenue.
Hansen realized what was happening and chased her, but she managed to reach the busy road.
And crucially, this is the detail that is just brilliant. Before she ran, she intentionally slipped off her blue Snickers, and she left them right there on the passenger side floorboard of Hansen's car.
Leaving the shoes behind is just an astounding display of psychological clarity under unimaginable stress.
She flagged down a passing truck driven by a man named Robert Yount, who took her to the Mush Inn. She eventually hid at the Big Timber Motel, where the police found her, terrified but alive.
It's an incredible survival story.
It really is. But what does it reveal to you about raw human survival instincts? Because you have to remember, when she first told her story to the police, they initially dismissed it.
Yeah, they did.
They looked at her background, they looked at the harmless baker who had a friend willing to provide a fake alibi, and they almost let it go.
Well, it reveals that high-level cognitive function can sometimes override primal panic. Cindy Paulson intuitively understood her place in society's hierarchy.
She knew they wouldn't believe her.
Right. She knew that her word as a teenage sex worker would be weighed against the word of an established, married business owner, and she knew she would lose that equation.
So by leaving her blue sneakers in his car,
she anchored her trauma to physical, undeniable reality. She forced the investigative system to engage with empirical evidence rather than their own biases about her credibility.
and thank God she forced their hand, because that evidence allowed Detective Glenn Floth of the Alaska State Troopers to finally start connecting the dots.
He was already investigating the bodies of Eklutna Annie, Joanna Messina, and Sherry Morrow.
Right, and he recognized the similarities in the MO and realized they were dealing with a highly organized serial killer.
So Floth did something relatively rare for the time.
He reached out to the FBI.
Yes, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, specifically to Special Agent John E. Douglas, to create a psychological profile.
Profiling in the early 1980s was still viewed with a lot of skepticism by traditional law enforcement.
Oh, definitely. It was often dismissed as guesswork, but John Douglas approached it scientifically.
Right.
He looked at the crime scenes, the remote drop zones, the use of a bush plane, the specific choice of a .223 caliber rifle.
And the meticulous post-mortem redressing of Sherry Morrow.
Exactly. And he began to reverse engineer the mind of the killer.
If we think about profiling as reverse engineering a piece of software, Douglas looked at the output, the crime scenes, to figure out the original code of the killer's insecurities.
That's a great way to put it. And the resulting profile was a mirror image of Robert Hansen.
Douglas stated the killer would be an experienced hunter, a man with low self-esteem, a history of intense rejection by women, and someone who kept physical souvenirs.
And then he predicted the killer likely had a stutter.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
That prediction of a speech impediment is what elevated the profile from a general assessment to a laser-focused investigative tool.
Absolutely.
But how exactly does that work? I mean, how do you look at a body in the woods and predict that the guy who put it there stutters?
Well, building on that reverse engineering analogy, profilers understand that extreme compensatory control points to extreme social insecurity.
Okay.
A man who kidnaps women, isolates them in the wilderness, and hunts them is playing God because he feels entirely impotent in everyday life.
That makes sense.
Douglas knew that this level of pathological social inadequacy usually stems from a highly visible physical or social flaw that caused deep, repeated humiliation during the killer's formative teenage years.
And a severe stutter fits that perfectly.
Right, it's one of the most classic triggers for intense childhood bullying and romantic rejection. Douglas deduced that the killer lacked the basic social fluency to interact with women normally, which drove his need to physically overpower them.
That makes perfect mechanical sense. So armed with that profile matching the baker, and crucially Cindy Paulson's testimony and the physical evidence of her shoes, the police finally secured a search warrant.
On October 27, 1983,
They raided Hansen's home, his cars, and his airplane.
and the search warrant yielded an overwhelming cascade of physical evidence that just completely corroborated the profile and the victim's testimony.
They found the .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 rifle. They found the stash of victim's jewelry in his attic.
Which included a very specific fish necklace that belonged to a missing woman named Andrea Fish Altieri.
Wow. And, of course, right behind the headboard of his bed, they found the aviation map. It had somewhere between 24 and 37 X marks on it.
The map was essentially a serialized confession written in ink.
When you combine that with the ballistics match from the rifle to Sherry Morrow's body, the evidentiary loop was closed.
They had him.
They really did. They brought Hansen into the interrogation room and laid this mountain of evidence out in front of him.
And according to prosecutor Frank Rothschild, who was observing the interrogation, the facade finally collapsed.
Rothschild noted that Hansen underwent an actual physical transformation right there in the room. His neck turned bright red, the hair on his arms and neck stood up, and his demeanor shifted entirely.
The mild-mannered, stuttering baker vanished.
And the apex predator from the wilderness was suddenly sitting at the table?
The physical transformation happens because the facade is just no longer serving its purpose. The halo effect he relied on was shattered by ballistics and maps.
Stripped of his camouflage, the underlying rage and control issues surface immediately.
But faced with undeniable proof, he had no strategic choice left but to negotiate.
He confessed to a staggering level of violence. I mean, he admitted to killing at least 17 women and raping over 30 others since 1971.
The authorities struck a plea deal with him. They really wanted to avoid a massive, traumatizing, and highly publicized trial.
And Hansen, for his part, was terrified of being sent to a federal penitentiary where his crimes against women would make him a huge target.
Right. So he pled guilty to the 4 murders they had hard evidence for: Sherry Morrow, Joanna Messina, Paula Goulding, and Eklutna Annie, plus the kidnapping of Cindy Paulson.
And in exchange, he was required to get in a helicopter with state troopers and physically point out the unmarked graves in the Alaskan wilderness.
He led investigators to 17 graves in total, 12 of which were previously entirely unknown to law enforcement.
But he refused to explain all the marks on his map.
Yeah, he took the identities of those remaining X marks to his grave, maintaining just a sliver of that power and control until the very end.
Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He spent the rest of his life behind bars, eventually dying of natural causes at age 75 on August 21st, 2014.
Good riddance.
Seriously, as we close out this deep dive into the files, it forces us to look at the broader implications. Beyond the mechanics of the crimes, what is the ultimate takeaway from the Butcher-Baker case?
Well, the takeaway is a stark lesson in how societal biases act as an accelerant for predators.
We have to recognize the profound courage and quick thinking of Cindy Paulson.
Absolutely. She anchored the truth to physical evidence when she knew her voice wouldn't be enough.
But the case files also show us that predators thrive in the blind spots we create.
Exactly. When a society decides that certain populations, runaways, transient workers, sex workers, are less than or invisible,
They are practically handing over a hunting license to people like Robert Hansen.
the justice system's failure to rigorously prosecute him in 1971 literally cost at least 17 women their lives.
It proves that a victim's background or profession should never be a metric for the urgency of an investigation.
Never.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Robert Hansen was an expert bow hunter. He was a licensed pilot with access to remote, unforgiving terrain. He had an arsenal of high-powered rifles.
Right.
But his absolute greatest weapon wasn't a gun or an airplane. His greatest weapon was the mask of normalcy. He baked bread for his neighbors. He went to church. He played with his kids in the front yard.
Terrifying.
It forces you to wonder, how many dangerous people are hiding in plain sight right now, relying entirely on our lazy assumptions of what a good neighbor looks like to operate completely undetected?
It's a dark thought, but a necessary one.
Thanks for listening to The Evidence Room. If you enjoyed this episode, like and subscribe for more true crime investigations from around the world.